Wonderful. So thank you and welcome to our online book group once again, coming from Canterbury Cathedral. And this time we are looking at the Rule of St Benedict, which I guess is a great way to start the new year. And of course, it's Epiphany today. So it's a real wonderful way of thinking about, how can we live out our faith in ordinary life, and how can we really embed our faith into a kind of rhythm and pattern of what we do and what we believe and how we pray. And of course, the master of doing that, helping us to do that, is St Benedict. So we're really going to approach this text together and see what we can glean from him and his wisdom to take into our own lives, not just our ordinary lives at home and everything, our private lives, I guess, personal lives, but also into the places where we work. Because actually you'll find that he has a hell of a lot to say for how we engage with one another and how we live as a community of people valuing one another. So I will stop waffling like that. And what I'm going to do this week is I'm going to give you a little bit of background about who Benedict was, or who we think he was, or who we've been told he was, because actually those things are very subtle differences. So the main source for knowing something about St Benedict is actually found from the second volume of Pope Gregory's Gregory the First Dialogues, and they're believed to be written in about 593, but there is some dispute about the actual date of that. So in that book, he tells us about St Benedict, but it's not so much a biography as we would know today. It's much more a spiritual hagiography. And this was very much a type of writing which had a moral and spiritual message to it, that the life of the saint was held up as a kind of, this is the way to live the life of holiness. This is a way to know God, not just, let's find out how their personal life was, and isn't that interesting? But it's actually to be a real beacon for us in our own spiritual lives. So we have a particular viewpoint of St Benedict, and it's very much made up of anecdotes and also of stories. And so some of the stories are going to be based on truth, and some of them are going to be sort of embellished a bit, and some of them are going to be purely moral, purely have a spiritual meaning, which we have to understand at a spiritual level, not necessarily at a literal level. So if you think there was a whole range of writing of hagiography throughout the medieval period, and I guess one that we may know really well is Bede's portrayal of St Cuthbert in his ecclesiastical history of the English people. And there he gives us this wonderful view of St Cuthbert and the eider ducks and Cuthbert and the otters, and so it's that kind of thing. So if you can get that in your kind of head, then you'll know what we're really dealing with Gregory. So if you want to delve into these moral tales, okay, then if you want to have a real look at it, then of course go back to Gregory. But there's this fabulous book that I was given by Jonathan, actually, and it's by the wonderful Joan Chichester, whose spiritual reading of the rule I recommended. But what she's done is she's done this book called The Radical Christian Life. And basically what she's done is she's taken all the different stories that Gregory tells, and she puts it into little anecdotes that you can read throughout the year. But it gives you a real idea of what those stories were like, those moral tales. Anyway, getting back to St Benedict and what we can glean from Gregory. He was born around 480 in Nursia in Umbria, which is the modern day Norcia. And he was born to a high Roman family, so he's pretty well off. And because of that, he was sent to Rome to study, to complete his studies. But Benedict, and this quote, whose heart burned with love of God, soon became disenchanted with the debauchery of the metropolitan Rome. And so he abandoned his studies and he also abandoned Rome to pursue a call, what he understood as a call from God to live in solitude. He settled in a small place near Enfide, 2 miles from Subiaco, in the Sibruini Mountains, so in Italy. So a very short distance from Enfide is the entrance to a very narrow and gloomy valley, which reaches right into the heart of the mountainous region that actually leads to Subiaco. And the path ascends by the side of a really steep ravine until it comes to a cave. On one side of the cave are these kind of sheer cliffs that rise up to the top of the mountains. And whilst the other side, there's this deep descent that goes down to, in Benedict's day, what was a lake at the bottom. Now, the story goes that on his way to Enfide, Benedict met a monk from the monastery that was actually on top of the mountain, which was above the cave underneath. And this monk, Romanus of Subiaco, started to have a conversation with him about why he was there, what he was leaving in Rome, and talking about his sort of spiritual understanding and calling and his burning of heart, and why he'd come to Subiaco. And then Romanus, it was he, it said, who gave him a monk's habit, and he became a hermit. And then he lived in this cave above the lake for about 3 years. Now, it's slightly different sources, but the one that Joan Chichester speaks about is that actually Romanus didn't tell anyone that Benedict was there, and instead he lowered food down to him that he took from his own plate, and he cared for him when any need arose. So he's kind of there in secret, sort of hidden. And actually, he's following very good tradition of the desert fathers and mothers who go to deserted places and there to be with God, but not just to be with God, because as we know, when we go into solitude or into silence, one of the biggest things that we have to contend with is ourselves. And so it's actually a place of great temptations, and also, inner sort of working things out, and also a place of great spiritual maturing and growth. So he's living in this place, and he's really going really in depth into the spiritual life, the being with God and being with himself and all that would tear him away from knowing God. And even though he's not, nobody's been told about him, he's already beginning to get a reputation. So you probably hear say around the valley, well, who's that strange man up in the cave? So his reputation for holiness is beginning to spread about the countryside. And during this time, he lived purely the life of a hermit. And he came to have so much respect by the people around him that once the abbot of the monastery above the cliff had died, the monks came and asked him to actually be their abbot. Now, Benedict was very aware that this community had somehow lost its way. And he knew, this is a quote, their manners were diverse from his, and therefore that they could never agree. Well, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yet at length, overcome with their entreaty, he gave his consent. So he's agreed, basically, to take the poison chalice of this community and really try and sort them out, not just in an organizational way, but also in a spiritual way. And I guess the spiritual comes first, and then the organization comes other, but the two are intertwined in Benedict's understanding of community life and life lived with God. So he's doing something quite radical in his own life and with this community. So when the monks realize just how demanding it's going to be for them to really revive their community, to revive the place and take it to the spiritual heights of what they would want through Benedict's teaching and management, I guess, and leadership, then they absolutely balked at it and thought, no, don't really want to do that. Thank you very much. And so the person who they entreated to go back and to go and be their abbot, they actually decide that they don't want him there at all, and he's absolutely ruining their lives, and that they've got to get rid of him. And they set out to try and poison poor old Benedict. There are two really, really wonderful stories that Gregory tells of different ways in which Benedict's sanctity overcomes these intentions to poison him. The first is about a poisoned cup. That when Benedict makes the sign of the cross over the cup, then suddenly it shatters. And it's not as if it kind of breaks up. It shatters so much as if someone's thrown an enormous stone at it and it just breaks apart. Probably looks like, really dramatic in that sense. I'm sure there's a little bit of embellishment there, but you get the point, is that, the sanctity of the person overcomes the evil intentions of these other monks. And then there's another story when Benedict had actually left the group and he'd returned to his cave, that there was this envious priest in the neighborhood who tried to give him some poisoned bread. And as Benedict prayed a blessing over the bread, suddenly a raven comes down and sweeps it off and takes the bread away. And of course, this has got wonderful, resonance, I guess, with Elijah out in the wilderness and him being fed by ravens. And it sort of shows here that, once again, Benedict's sanctity, holiness, holy living overcomes all that can anything that is trying to destroy him. There's this wonderful thing in Julian where she talks about, you have no fears because the devil has been overcome, and talks about that as if not with the real knowledge that we live in the resurrection, that we don't live in a sort of a world where the devil can have power because Christ is conquered. And it's absolutely knowing and living in that truth that we see being envisaged, yes, in Benedict. So then Gregory tells us also how these miracles, these stories about Benedict, um, continue to grow and grow and grow. And so many people, so his reputation is spreading out now. And many people come to see him and to hear what he has to say, but also to follow him, to follow his lifestyle. They're drawn to him. And that's very like the desert fathers and mothers. They were originally called the monos, the individual ones, the solo ones, the hermits, monos, living in the desert in these sort of little huts. But they attracted so many people that actually what happened was they had these little huts and then they had round them all these other little huts where people gathered together. So the monos, the one that works or is alone, becomes the monastery, where actually they live in community. So that's how we get the notion of monastery, which I think is rather lovely. Yeah. Anyway, so lots of people are coming to Benedict to get his guidance. However, that envious priest is still up to his tricks, and he tries to seduce the followers with various temptations. And as a result, Benedict decides to leave his cave, and he leaves Subiaco and the whole area in 530. And instead, what happens is he then begins to found 12 monasteries in the vicinity of Subiaco. And eventually, in 530, he founded the great monastery of Monte Cassino. And it'd be interesting if any of you have actually been there to see it. I never have, but it would be amazing to. And of course, it lies on a hilltop, just like the original monastery, on a hilltop between Rome and Naples. Then on the 21st of March, 547, Benedict dies. He dies of a fever at Monte Cassino, and he was buried with his sister, Scholastica. And this is really interesting. So you can go and see his remains in Monte Cassino. But we had this really surreal experience actually when we were holidaying in France, and it wasn't last summer; it was the summer before, so 24. And we just had a look we were going around all the churches and all the chateaux as you do, and we were staying in the Loire Valley. And suddenly we went to one of these churches, which is called St. Benoit-sur-Loire. I thought, oh, this is interesting, really nice place. And suddenly we walked down into this crypt, and there were the remains, was the body, or the remains of St. Benedict. And all of us it just kind of blew our minds a little bit, and we couldn't understand where he got that. And it was just a surreal but amazing moment. So we all sort of stood there and lit candles and said prayers, and it was a bit like meeting or seeing or being with someone who you had only ever heard of in the dim past, and then actually there were his remains before us, that kind of tangible link with the present. And of course, I shouldn't be surprised about that, because we kind of had that all the time here at Canterbury. But this was someone, I suppose, who had enormous influence on my life. That actually there he was. Anyway, I thought I've got to show you a picture. This was taken from Thomas's camera, and let me just share it with you. Let me share. There we are. So on the the left, you will see some candle stands, and then there's looks like an altar, and then there's a kind of a box. So that was where that's actually where his remains were. And then on the right is the amazing, the amazing church of St. Benoit-sur-Loire. Now, the reason why it's there, I've looked into it a little bit, and the reason it's there is because during the Lombard invasions of the area of Monte Cassino, the abbey, the Abbey of Fleury Abbey in France, this was happening in the 7th century, sent monks over there to actually retrieve his remains so they weren't then lost. So they went on a kind of pilgrimage to, to make sure that I suppose, the founder of their order wasn't lost. And then and then after the Lombard invasions, portions of his body remained in St. Benoit, and some of them were returned to Monte Cassino. So if you ever want to go and, stand in the presence of the earthly remains of St. Benedict, then you can go to Monte Cassino, or you can go to the beautiful Loire Valley in France. So there's my... So actually, while I'm still screen sharing, I'll give you this opportunity just to look at the questions to ponder. I will put these into the chat, but please do take screenshots of it so you can have a look. This week, we were reading the prologue and chapters 1 to 3, and I guess the prologue is one of the finest pieces of writing, a monastic writing that we have. And so there's so much there for you to just dwell and talk about, that I think, be really interesting to see how it strikes you, and also the kind of modern feel that it has for us today. And does it inspire you? And in what ways does it inspire you, this prologue? And just to also ponder, why do we need a rule? Why can't we, just as Christians, live with each other? Why do we need something to help us a little bit more than that? And it's really interesting that straight after the prologue, Benedict goes immediately into the leadership of the community. And it might be just quite interesting to step back and think, well, why does he do that? He does that now, and he actually leaves the tools for good works to well, we'll look at that next week. But actually here we're talking about the superior, and how the community is organized. And we have this really beautiful, clear directive in chapter 3, which I think it should go into every boardroom, every chapter meeting, every meeting, whether the youngest is heard, the person who doesn't hold authority, who is easily dismissed, is heard. Everybody is spoken to, and then one person makes the clear decision, having listened to all the wisdom in the room, and then everyone puts aside their own opinions and goes with it. It's very clear. It's just really clear, and he labels this as obedience, monastic obedience. Now, what do we understand then by that notion of obedience? Do we want to put that label on it, or is our understanding of obedience really negative, or is this giving us a positive sort of angle on it? And and do you ever manage meetings like that? So those are the questions for you to ponder.